Well, hello everybody. I decided that in honor of America's 250th, that I would give a presentation on James Madison. He was our fourth president and a critical part of our country's history. But most people do remember Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin, and Madison often takes a back seat. He was a quieter man, but it didn't mean he was not influential in our country's founding. And he was just as important. He was the man who drafted the Constitution. He attended every meeting of the 1787 convention, and he later wrote the Bill of Rights. He led the country through the War of 1812, and he assisted several presidents in cabinet, and also presidents while he was outside their cabinet. He and his wife, Dolly, created the role of our government and the First Lady. We still see those roles in the White House today. James was born March 16th, 1751, to James and Eleanor Madison in Port Conway, Virginia. His father, James Madison Sr., was one of the biggest plantation owners in the area. And James Sr. and his father Ambrose both grew tobacco. Ambrose was killed at 36. He was poisoned by his slaves. One of the slaves involved was executed for this crime. Eleanor Conway Madison was the daughter of Francis Conway, a wealthy tobacco merchant. Port Conway was named after her father, and Belle Grove was actually her family estate, and Eleanor had a huge influence in the life of her son. James was the oldest of 12, but only half of his siblings lived into adulthood. Francis, Ambrose, William, Nellie, Sarah, and Francis. The fact that only half his siblings lived to adulthood was really not uncommon for the time. His brother William would serve in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Ambrose would help manage the Montpelier estate, the house that Madison's family moved into in the 1760s. From ages 11 to 15, Donald Robertson, who was a popular teacher, educated James, and James was a very inquisitive child, even as he was educated away from home. Later, he studied under Reverend Thomas Martin, and the Reverend would prepare James for university study. James was exceptional in Latin, but he also learned geography and math as well. In 1769, Madison began his university studies at the College of New Jersey, which eventually became, as we know it, Princeton. This was a very unique choice. James was very close to the College of William and Mary, and most Virginians chose to go to William and Mary. But it's possible, since James had health issues, that his parents thought it would be better if he was away from the hot and humid climate in Virginia. When he finished his undergraduate degree, he continued studying under John Witherspoon, and Witherspoon would later sign the Declaration of Independence. James was the college's first graduate student. He studied Hebrew and philosophy. After returning to Montpelier, Madison seemed confused what path he should take for a career. So he began studying law under his friend William Bradford. James did not want to be a lawyer, and in his lifetime, he never joined the bar. He just wanted to study the law, regardless of whether he practiced it. And so he studied democracies. His favorites were the ones in ancient times. And he also tutored his younger siblings. But unfortunately, during parts of the Revolutionary War, Madison suffered from exhaustion and anxiety. It's possible he was epileptic. Although Madison was ill during some of the Revolutionary War period, it did not stop him from becoming active in politics. He joined the Patriots in 1765 under the Continental Congress. He was against tax policies of the British government. and he felt colonies had been overtaxed. He also knew some colonies established state religions. Madison was a believer of the separation of church and state, and he wanted to get rid of these policies. He wanted to de-establish the Anglican Church in Virginia and all the churches in other colonies as well. So one of Madison's first roles was on the Committee of Safety. A year later, he was promoted to the colonel of Orange County, Virginia, Milito, where he worked with his father. After that position, he was elected to the 5th Virginia Congress. Here, he helped draft Virginia's first Constitution. He also helped revise their Declaration of Rights. And it was in this position he became part of Virginia's inner circle. And he served on the Virginia House of Delegates on Virginia's Council of State. And this was where he met Thomas Jefferson, who was at the time governor of Virginia. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania wrote the Articles of Confederation in 1777, and they were ratified 4 years later in 1781. So it was not easy to achieve ratification. States were concerned about equal representation, or by population. They wondered how they would determine money contributions from the state to the central government, and also the Western lands. Each state had one vote in the Continental Congress, and money contributions were determined by the amount of acreage in proportion to the value of privately owned land. All the Western lands became the United States' own property. 9 of 13 states had to agree on any decision-making during the Articles of Confederation. And to make an amendment, it had to be unanimous. Everybody had to agree. So any powers that were not retained in the Articles of Confederation were retained by the states. The Articles of Confederation were problematic from the very beginning. The Continental Congress had so many issues. One was the inflation of continental paper currency. It was to the point that the government could not pay their Revolutionary War veterans for their service in the military. The Articles of the Confederation didn't even have the power to resolve this issue. So Congress's meeting place had to be moved 3 times before the peace treaty was signed with Great Britain. They had to go from Philadelphia to Princeton and later to Annapolis. Why? Well, they had to escape angry soldiers. They were demanding back pay for their service, and the issues led to a movement against the Articles of Confederation throughout the 1780s. This would lead to the adoption of the Constitution in 1787. So Madison participated in the debates concerning the Articles of Confederation. These started in November of 1777, and he contributed to the discussion of religious freedom. And he proposed liberalizing any article on religious freedom. But the Virginia Confederation did not want his radical language of free expression. They were not ready for that, so they made a less controversial, simple mention of tolerance in regards to religion. So Madison served on the Council of State for 2 years, 1777 to 1779. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress, which was the governing body of the United States. In addition to chaos in Congress, there was a lot of chaos among people. And in 1786, farmers demanded the states owed them paper money, and that their debts should be reduced by the cheapening of the dollar. This was known as Shays' Rebellion. Some states gave in and gave out paper money, but Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and Connecticut refused. So Daniel Shays' rebels continued to wreak havoc. In Western Massachusetts, farmers protested foreclosures and farm mortgages. Massachusetts refused to issue any paper money or bills of credit. And the farmers, they were so impoverished at this point and in debt that they didn't know if they could continue working and having their farms. So the state militia, after hearing the officers refused, Shea and his rebels attacked the United States Armory and Arsenal, which was in Springfield, Massachusetts. The state militia had to use grape-shot artillery, and the courts imprisoned the debtors or sold them into servitude. The rebellion was so frightening to people living in the United States, and James thought that the state of Massachusetts had encroached on individual rights. And so this situation led to the gathering for the federal convention. And Madison was concerned about unstable currency and economic prosperity. And he thought this was necessary to secure a Republican government. He felt that it would be very difficult to do without balance of federal powers. Delegates flocked to Philadelphia for the convention in 1787. It was a long journey for some of them. New Hampshire didn't make it on time, and Rhode Island could not participate. During the convention, the United States was in an economic downturn and depression. People were also upset and frightened by Shea's rebellion. Everyone was full of ideas and skilled in political theory. There were 4 key leaders at this convention: George Washington, who was the chair and delegate from Virginia; Alexander Hamilton, who advocated for a strong executive branch; James Madison, who had hopes for a stronger central government; and Ben Franklin, an 80-year-old familiar face among the country's leaders. So at the convention, delegates agreed on a stronger central government and separation of powers and a single executive officer. They were also looking for a bicameral legislature and a court system that was separated from the courts in their own states. 2 major plans were proposed at the convention: the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan was supported by James Madison, George Washington, and Edmund Randolph. They wrote it together. The plan did not edit the Articles of Confederation. Instead, it completely changed our entire government. The plan included a bicameral legislature, meaning 2 separated chambers of government. The lower house would be elected by the people, and the upper would be elected by the members of the lower house. They wanted representation by population, favoring the larger states. Madison and his friends wanted an executive branch chosen by the houses with separation of powers and 1-term limits. They also had the idea for a court system which balanced the power from the legislature. The federal government would be superior to state power. Congress could potentially veto laws. And then we have the New Jersey Plan. This was presented from William Patterson of New Jersey, who championed equal representation of all states. And he wanted a one-house, unicameral legislature. So he did not want 2 houses of government and a single Supreme Court. There was a compromise called the Connecticut Compromise, and it was a result that mixed both ideas. The people would elect a lower house, now our House of Representatives, and the lower house would elect our upper house, now the Senate. This was not how it is today. In 1913, the Senate started being elected by the people. The Connecticut Compromise resolved issues such as representation in the smaller states. So states are equally represented in the Senate, House of Representatives based on population. Slaves were counted as 3/5 towards the population, determining representation in the House, as well as taxation. The South did not want direct federal taxes. Luckily for them, it did not happen anyway. So our executive branch, which was the president, is elected by the Electoral College. And the founders didn't think many candidates would receive the majority of the votes and not win the election. So the executive branch had a limited veto. Congress could override the veto with 2/3 votes. And legislators would have 2 terms, senators 6, and they would be staggered so that 1/3 of the Senate would be up for election every 2 years. They wanted to prevent political fads from taking over both houses. So the judiciary branch was to be appointed by the president. Senator would confirm the nominees. So the Constitutional Convention did not specify high court power over statutes in the Constitution. It also did not provide for judicial review. But those things both happened over time. Our states were given a back seat with the adoption of the Constitution. The Constitution became the supreme law of the land, and all states and their officials had to uphold the laws stated in the Constitution. Powers not specified went to the states, and each state eventually created its own criminal law code. 9 states had to vote yes to ratify this Constitution, much easier than the Articles of Confederation. Out of 42 delegates, 3 didn't sign: Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, but it still entered the phase of the contest for ratification. And the delegates believed in the Constitution had to ensure it was ratified. The opposition movement, called the Anti-Federalists, were mainly farmers and supporters of states' rights over a strong central government. But they appeared in correlation between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. There were patterns in geographic location and economic circumstances. Madison was the one that found a way to appease the opposition. He knew there was no Bill of Rights, and he felt the Constitution could threaten civil liberties. And his state of Virginia had a Declaration of Rights. And he tried to make a Bill of Rights proposal that failed at the Constitutional Convention, but he still sponsored a Bill of Rights as the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. And this way, he would effectively neutralize anti-federalists. In addition, Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, wrote the Federalist Papers. They were published anonymously. Their goal was to explain that the Constitution was okay and people should support it. They didn't want the public to be afraid of a national government, and a strong government was not going to hurt them. The papers were published in New York newspapers. They pointed out the Articles of Confederation were not an adequate way to run the government. The Constitution would improve the lives of people, and the document was worth voting on and ratifying. Only 25% of adults actually voted in these elections to ratify the Constitution. Women and slaves were not allowed to vote, and 17% of adults voted for the Constitution. They had some problem states like New Hampshire and Rhode Island, and sometimes divisions occurred in bigger states. It took until the Union was fully functioning for Rhode Island and North Carolina to ratify the Constitution. Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York only voted for it after the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution itself. And it became an integral part of the founding of the United States government. It is just as important today. Madison introduced the Bill of Rights on June 8, 1789. His amendments contained a lot of restrictions on the federal government, but he wanted to protect freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the right for a peaceful assembly or protest. And while most of his amendments were drawn from ratifying conventions, he wanted to guarantee proposals for freedom of press, protect property, and ensure jury trials. He wanted equal rights of conscience and a trial by jury for criminal cases. He wanted to prevent a federal standing army. He was not a big fan of the military, so he proposed the Second Amendment. It gave state-regulated militant groups and private citizens what we call the right to bear arms. Madison and Republicans desired a free government to be established by the people rather than a military. So Madison's Bill of Rights didn't have a lot of opposition. He really neutralized the anti-federalists, and he helped them achieve their goal of amending the Constitution. And he did it without alienating the supporters of the Constitution. The House of Representatives and the Senate passed the Bill of Rights. Although the Senate made many changes, Madison's proposal to apply parts of the Bill of Rights to the states was eliminated, and they took out the preamble, which would be enhanced by a paragraph indicating that the government power is vested by its own people. He was disappointed that the Bill of Rights didn't include protections against actions by state governments. But the document had taken away some critics of the original Constitution, and it gave him much more support in his home state of Virginia. So the 10 amendments were ratified in December of 1791, and this was the Bill of Rights we have today. In 1789, Madison was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He served 4 terms, and it was here that he secured the passage of the Bill of Rights. Madison returned to New York and resumed his duties in Congress. And Madison tried to run for the U.S. Senate in Virginia in 1788. Madison was defeated, which then he had some concerns for his political career. There was a big possibility Patrick Henry and his allies wanted a second constitutional convention. And Patrick Henry became a thorn in Madison's side. Madison ran for the House of Representatives, and Henry made sure that the Anti-Federalists were in control in Virginia in the autumn of 1788. And they were going to do anything to deny Madison a seat. They gerrymandered the congressional districts, and Henry and his supporters made sure that Madison's county, which was Orange County, had a heavy population of Anti-Federalists, and that Madison would be heavily opposed. So Henry also recruited James Monroe to challenge Madison. Madison promised to support constitutional amendments to protect liberties of individuals. He also wrote an open letter, and he said while he opposed requiring alterations to the Constitution before it was ratified, he said that amendments, if pursued with proper moderation and proper mode, may serve a double purpose of satisfying the minds of well-meaning opponents. And his promise paid off. He won the seat in Congress for Virginia's 5th district election with 57% of the vote. Madison became a key advisor to Washington, and Washington valued Madison's passion and understanding of the United States Constitution. Madison helped Washington write his inaugural address and prepared the House response to the speech. And he staffed 3 cabinet departments, and influenced Thomas Jefferson to become the first Secretary of State. Madison helped introduce a tariff bill similar to the one he advocated for under the Articles of Confederation. And so there would be a federal tariff on imports starting in 1789. Secretary Hamilton introduced an economic program that called for the assumption of state debts and funding that debt through the issuance of federal securities. So Hamilton's plan favored the North. It was disadvantaged to the states in the South, such as Virginia. Virginia had already paid off their debts. So Madison was one of the main opponents of the plan. Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton eventually compromised in the Compromise of 1790. And they enacted Hamilton's plan as part of the Funding Act of 1790. And they then passed the Residence Act. And this made the federal capital Washington, D.C. So like many of Washington's associates, Madison lobbied the president for a second term. Washington had already asked Madison to prepare his farewell address. And this began to drive the two men apart, and their relationship would deteriorate from here. After 1790, the Washington administration became polarized. They became two separate factions. So one was led by Jefferson and Madison. It represented the South and sought relations with France. This became the Democratic Republican Party, and it was opposed to Washington and Hamilton. Hamilton led the Federalists, which represented the North and favored relations with Britain. In 1791, Hamilton introduced the plan that wanted to establish a national bank to provide loans for emerging industries and oversee money supply. Madison and his party, the Democratic Republicans, fought against Hamilton's attempt. They argued that under the Constitution, Congress did not have the power to establish a national bank. Despite Madison's opposition, they passed the bill anyway. Washington signed the bill into law in 1791. Hamilton got to implement his program, and Washington continued to enjoy the prestige of the presidency. Madison, on the other hand, came increasingly concerned that Hamilton wanted to eventually abolish the federal republic and go back to the ways of the monarchy. Hamilton submitted a report on manufactures, and that was to have the development of a diversified economy. Madison was once again challenging Hamilton. And Madison and Jefferson, along with Philip Freneau, established a paper called the National Gazette in Philadelphia. And what this paper did was attack Hamilton's proposals. They wrote in the newspaper in 1792, the country had divided into two factions. His faction that believed that mankind are capable of governing themselves, and Hamilton's, which allegedly sought the establishment of an aristocratic monarchy and was in favor of the wealthy. And those who continued to oppose Hamilton's policies, including some former anti-federalists, began to join and strengthen the Democratic Republican Party. In the 1792 election, both parties did support Washington for his re-election, but they wanted to unseat John Adams. So the Constitution's rules actually precluded Thomas Jefferson from challenging Adams. The party backed George Clinton for the vice presidency, but Adams still won. Jefferson was out of office in 1793, and Madison became the de facto leader of that Democratic-Republican Party. France and Britain ended up at war in 1793. The U.S. was at odds who to support. And so the differences between the parties had usually been economical, but foreign policy started becoming more and more important. Madison and Jefferson favored France, Hamilton, Britain. And war with Britain was almost imminent in 1794. The British seized hundreds of American ships while they were trading with the French. Madison believed a trade war with Britain would probably succeed. But he also argued that British industry was so dependent on American consumers that they would really suffer in the market if they were denied to the British. But Washington had a completely different view from Madison, and they actually created trade relations with Britain through the Jay Treaty. And the Democratic Republicans were outraged. A friend of Madison's, Robert R. Livingston, another Democratic Republican, wrote to Madison that the treaty sacrifices every essential interest in honor of our country. Madison's strong opposition led to a permanent break in his friendship with Washington. Madison had happy news in 1794, and on September 15th, he married Dolly Payne Todd, who was a widow of John Todd, a Quaker farmer, who had died during the yellow fever epidemic. They had also lost their younger son. And earlier that year, Madison and Dolly were introduced by Aaron Burr. And Burr had become friends with Dolly while they stayed in the same Philadelphia boarding house. And Madison and Dolly hit it off and were engaged and prepared for a wedding in the summer. Dolly was still suffering recurring illnesses because of her exposure to the yellow fever epidemic. And they married in September and traveled to Harewood for their wedding. It was a very small wedding, but Dolly became a renowned figure in Washington. She would excel in hosting. She established the image of the First Lady. And she once said, "A strong woman is one who can support and lift others up, even in the face of adversity." Madison never had children with Dolly, but he adopted her own one surviving son, John Payne Todd. And unfortunately, Payne had issues with alcohol and his finances most of his life. Washington retired after serving 2 terms. Madison helped convince Jefferson to run for the presidency. And despite those efforts, John Adams still defeated Jefferson. But it was a very narrow majority of the electoral vote. But under the rules of the Electoral College, Jefferson, coming in second place, became vice president. And Madison declined to seek re-election. He returned to Montpelier. And on Jefferson's advice, Adams considered having Madison in the cabinet. But Adams' cabinet members were so against Madison that he chose not to have him in the cabinet. Madison still continued to be a prominent Democratic Republican leader. He attacked Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts, which gave the U.S. the right to deport foreigners, and also imprisoned them for talking against their government. Madison often called Adams a monarchist. Madison believed that the Alien and Sedition Acts formed a dangerous precedent. It went against the natural rights of its own citizens. Madison urged the states to respond through interposition, which was a process by which state legislature said this law is unconstitutional, but they did not do anything to enforce it. So in 1799, Madison was elected back to Virginia legislature, and he helped Jefferson with his campaign in the 1800 presidential election. Madison issued the Report of 1800, which attacked the Alien and Sedition Acts. They called them unconstitutional. And Jefferson embraced the report. It became an unofficial platform in their election. And Jefferson won with his running mate Aaron Burr. They defeated Adams. And in 1801, James Madison's father died, and he inherited Montpelier and over 100 slaves. Madison was one of the two major influences in Jefferson's cabinet, and he served as Secretary of State, which is an interesting choice by Jefferson, considering Madison had barely any foreign policy experience. The other main influence was Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin. And though he was new to Congress, he received a lot of assistance from his wife Dolly, and he relied on her quite a bit, becoming a public figure in cabinet and just in general as Secretary of State and onward. And the Democratic Republicans became disenchanted with the French after the ascent of Napoleon. Madison sought a neutral position in the war between France and Britain. And domestically, Jefferson and the other Democratic Republicans rolled back the Federalist policies. They abolished internal taxes, and they reduced the size of the Army and Navy. But they did retain the First National Bank. In 1802, Jefferson and Madison sent James Monroe to France to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans. And New Orleans controlled access to the Mississippi River, and it was extremely important to the American frontier. But Napoleon's government chose to sell the entire territory of Louisiana. Before even getting authorization from Thomas Jefferson, Monroe and Livingston, who was America's minister to France, negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. France gave us 827,987 square miles in exchange for $15 million. Jefferson was able to maintain cordial relationships with both France and Britain in the beginning of his term. But the relationships with the Britain deteriorated after 1805. Britain would no longer tolerate American shipping and began seizing American goods that were headed towards France. So they also impressed American sailors, some of whom were defected from the British Navy. Some had never been British subjects, though. In response, Congress passed the Non-Importation Act, which restricted almost all British imports. And then, in 1807, there was a confrontation between American and British naval forces, and the French began attacking American shipping. So Madison believed that the economic pressure could force the British to end their seizure of American shipped goods, and they passed the Embargo Act of 1807. It banned all exports to foreign nations. This was extremely unpopular and difficult to enforce, especially in New England. So Congress replaced the embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act, which allowed trade with nations other than Britain and France. Madison had served as Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, but Jefferson declined to run for a third term, and he threw his entire support behind Madison. And Vice President George Clinton and James Monroe also wanted the Democratic-Republican leadership, but James Madison won the party's nomination. And Madison took office after defeating Federalist Charles Pinckney in 1808. He said, "I might have had a better chance had I faced Mr. Madison alone." Charles Pinckney said after losing the 1808 election to Mr. and Mrs. Madison. So Madison's inauguration took place in 1809 on March 4th, in the House chamber of the U.S. Capitol, and Justice Marshall administered the oath of office. President Jefferson was there to observe. And George Clinton was sworn in for a second term. He was the first vice president to serve under two presidents. Madison had a number of political opposition from his former allies. But additionally, the Federalist Party was resurgent, partly because the embargo was so unpopular. And Madison had to choose cabinet members based on political harmony and alliances, but many of them were incompetent. Due to the resistance of Monroe and Clinton, Madison could not do the nomination Treasury Gallatin to Secretary of State like he planned, so he had to keep him in the Treasury Department. Madison had to make Robert Smith Secretary of State, but Madison had to do almost all his work because Smith was so incompetent. And Madison eventually replaced Smith with Monroe in 1811. Madison rarely called cabinet meetings. He chose to just consult with Gallatin alone. Madison sought to continue a lot of Jefferson's policies, like low taxes and reduction of the debt. He, in 1811, allowed the charter of the First National Bank to lapse. He didn't seem to really care about the issue at all. So Dolly served as First Lady from 1809 to 1817. She put in much more effort than her two predecessors. She was happy with public life, and she forged a huge role as the president's wife. She established herself as a standard which all her successors would end up being held to this day. So this persona was specifically created to serve the political people, and not just the president, but also the entire United States. She would steer a conversation with political figures and their spouses. She wanted to know their positions on issues facing the Madison administration. And then she asked them to continue the viewpoint of their husband. She was immense in her role of hostess, and she created a visual effect of both the executive mansion and her own. She redecorated all the rooms in a grand style. That way they could impress foreign diplomats. And she had a regal yet simple style. And she made herself distinct and defined her own public identity, mostly with her trademark turban. Dolly was the First Lady to associate herself with the fundraiser or public project, and she founded the Washington, D.C. Home for Orphaned Girls. It still exists to this day. She also befriended nuns from Catholic schools and began a lifelong association with that organization, with whom public to a degree larger than Martha Washington, and whom the public had been a familiar face since the American Revolution, Dolly became a celebrity. They referred to her as Lady Madison. Her legend was made lasting. Her biggest act of symbolic patriotism was by hours preceding the burning of Washington. She famously refused to leave the White House before being assured that the large portrait of George Washington was removed from the walls and taken to safety. Multiple factors led to the U.S. declaration of war on Great Britain. This began the War of 1812. There were trade restrictions introduced by the UK, and this would impede American trade with France, and Britain was at war with them. The impressment of seamen on U.S. vessels into the British Royal Navy. The British military were supporting American Indian tribes, and they offered arming resistance against U.S. expansion. There was a possible desire by the U.S. to annex some of Canada. As the important neutral trading nation, the United States became ensnarled in this conflict that pitted Napoleonic France against Great Britain and her allies. In 1806, France began to prohibit all neutral trade with Great Britain. In 1807, Great Britain banned trade with France, her allies, and the Americans. Congress passed the Embargo Act in 1807, prohibiting U.S. vessels from trading with European nations. And the Non-Intercourse Acts aimed solely at France and Britain. And these were so ineffective that the United States in 1910 had to open, once again, trade with France and Great Britain. So Great Britain continued to stop American merchant ships searching for Royal Navy deserters, and they were impressing American seamen on the high seas of the Royal Navy. And Madison made the issue of this impressment a matter of national sovereignty. Even after Britain agreed to end the practice, Congress declared a declaration of war on Great Britain in June of 1812. And some of this saw it as a call to arms. They also saw British and Spanish territory in North America as prizes to be won if they won the battle. The Federalists were outraged. They were upset with the Republican favoritism towards France. Jefferson responded, the English being equally tyrannical at sea as Napoleon on land, the tyranny bearing on us in every point of either honor or interest, I say, down with England. And after Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, the British focused on the American continent. They wanted to blockade the East Coast. They burned the White House and government buildings, acquired some territory in Maine and the Great Lakes region. So the American forces, however, won important naval victories at sea. Canadians defeated the American invasion of Lower Canada. But when 2 years passed and neither side was near a clear victory, they decided to settle. Under the mediation of a Tsar of Russia, Great Britain and United States finally came together to negotiate peace. They signed the Treaty of Ghent, which restored the political boundaries of North America to what it was before, and established Boundary Commission to resolve further territorial disputes. And they wanted to create peace with Indian nations on the frontier. The real causes were not just commerce and neutral rights, but a lot of it was expansion-based and relationships with American Indians and territory control. But the war created confidence. It solidified American independence. Madison became extremely popular despite difficulties he faced during this war. The post-war period of Madison's second term is what we see as the transition into the era of good feelings, which was started in the mid-1815 and went to 1817. So during the war, delegates from New England held the Hartford Convention. They asked for several amendments to the Constitution, and they celebrated unity. They saw this as the Second War of Independence from Britain. And Madison hastened the decline of the Federalists. He adopted several programs he had once opposed. Recognizing the difficulties of financing the war, he proposed the reestablishment of the National Bank. And he also had tariffs to protect American goods from foreign competition. And he authorized the federal government to fund construction of internal improvements like roads and canals. And Madison's initiatives now act on the behalf of the National Bank. And it appeared to reverse his opposition to Hamilton and were opposed by the strict constructionist of John Randolph, who stated that Madison's proposals now out Hamilton's Alexander Hamilton. So responding to the proposals, the 14th Congress was one of the most productive legislatures up to that point in history. and they granted the Second National Bank and passed a tariff of 1816, which set high import duties for goods, the ones that were produced outside the United States. And Madison improved federal spending on Cumberland Road, which was a link to the country's western lands. So on the topic of western lands, it brings us to the topic of Native Americans. How did James Madison feel about minorities? Well, Madison said the federal government's duties was actually to convert the Native Americans by the participation of improvements of which the human mind and matters are susceptible in a civilized state. And General Harrison wanted to push for a treaty to open more land for white settlement. The Miami, Way, and Kickapoo were vehemently opposed to selling any more land. Harrison decided that he would conclude a treaty with the tribes who were actually willing to sell. So he invited the Delaware and Eel Rivers to a meeting in Fort Wayne. And he said he promised large subsidies and direct payments if they would cede the lands. And Madison agreed to the Treaty of Fort Wayne, and it was negotiated and signed by Indiana Territory's Governor Harrison. So the Native Americans were compensated $5,000 in goods and $500,000 in cash in return for the new 3 million acres of land. And the treaty angered Shawnee leader Tecumseh. He said, "Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the clouds, the great sea, as well as the earth?" Madison had a paternalistic attitude towards the Native Americans. He wanted them to become farmers. But he thought the adoption of European-style agriculture would help them assimilate to the US civilization. But as pioneers and settlers moved west, Madison ordered the US Army to protect the Native Americans from intrusion. That was done to the anger of military commander Andrew Jackson. And he wanted Madison to ignore Native Americans' pleas to stop the invasion of their lands. And the United States and Tecumseh increasingly had tensions. And in the 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne, this led to Tecumseh's alliance with the British and Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 in Northwest Territory. Native American leaders were bitter, and before leaving discussions, Tecumseh told Harrison that unless the terms of the treaty were nullified, he would side with the British and seek an alliance with them. Tecumseh eventually was led to war, and he was defeated, and the Native Americans were pushed off their lands. And in 1814, approximately 23 million acres of land were given to Georgia and Alabama. Madison did not believe Native Americans could fully assimilate to the values of Euro-American culture. And he decided that the Native Americans had too great influence on the settlers they interacted with, and who were irresistibly attracted by complete liberty, freedom of bonds, obligations, and duties. And so Madison's Secretary of War, William Crawford, advocated for intermarriage between Native Americans and whites as a way of assimilating the former. This prompted a ton of public outrage and exasperated bigotry among white Americans. On the topic of slavery, Madison called slavery a dreadful blot on the nation. In reality, he was a garden variety Virginia slaveholder, and he relied on slave labor his entire life. He helped draft the 3/5 Compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for congressional representation. And he wrote the article in the Federalist Papers that defended and explained the 3/5 Compromise. In retirement, he supported the American Colonization Society. It sent free slaves to Africa. He thought the free blacks and whites relationship and coexistence was impossible. So he did not free his enslaved workers in his will. He left them to his wife, Dolly. He did ask that she sell them, only with their consent and in families, which she did not comply. And Madison did bring slaves with him to the White House. In 1816, the Democratic-Republican Party controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress. The election marked the era of good feelings, as the Federalist Party became almost irrelevant after the War of 1812. In the election, Democratic-Republican Secretary of State James Monroe defeated Federalist Senator Rufus King of New York. This was the last time the Federalists had a candidate. In the House, the Democratic-Republicans won major gains, and they continued to dominate the chamber. In the Senate, Democratic-Republicans picked up a moderate number of seats. Madison and Jefferson both really wanted and favored the candidacy of James Monroe. Madison left office as a popular president, and former President Adams wrote that Madison acquired more glory, established more union than all his three predecessors, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, put together. Madison left office at age 65 in 1817. He went straight to Montpelier. He left the presidency, like Washington and Jefferson, much poorer than when he started. His plantation experienced a financial collapse, partly due to the declines in tobacco, but also Paine was managing Montpelier and he mismanaged it. In Madison's retirement, he became occasionally involved in public affairs. He advised Andrew Jackson, but he stayed out of the debate of the Missouri Compromise. He privately complained about the North's opposition to the extension of slavery, and he had very good relationships with all the major candidates in the 1824 presidential election, but he stayed out of the race. During Jackson's presidency, Madison disavowed the nullification movement and argued no state had the right to secede. And Madison helped Jefferson establish the University of Virginia. And after Jefferson's death in 1826, Madison became the second rector of the university. And he would get that position and maintain it until his death 10 years later in 1836. In 1829, at 78, Madison was chosen as a representation to the Virginia Constitutional Convention. It was his last appearance in public as a statesman. The increased population in the Piedmont and western parts of the state of Virginia were not proportionally represented, and they wanted to extend suffrage to all white men in place of the prevailing prosperity of the ownership requirement. But Madison had some wins and some losses in this meeting. He had some gains, but was very disappointed that the Virginians did not vote to extend suffrage to all white men. In his latter years, Madison became highly concerned with his legacy. So he started modifying letters and other documents. He changed dates, days, added deleted words and sentences. By his late 70s, his self-editing was almost an obsession. During his final 6 years of life, he had a lot of personal troubles, and he was mentally agitated and almost physically capacitated. He was so sick with anxiety that he became bedridden at times, and he began to despair of the ability to make himself understood by the people. Madison's health slowly deteriorated throughout the 1830s. He died of heart failure at Montpelier on June 8, 1836. He was 85. And according to the most common account of his last moments, he was eating breakfast. He tried to eat, he was unable to swallow. His favorite niece, Nellie Madison Willis, asked him, "What's the matter, Uncle James?" And Madison died immediately, right after he replied, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." He was buried in the family cemetery at Montpelier, and he was one of the final members of the Revolutionary War generation to die. And he left a lot of money to the American Colonization Society, Princeton, the University of Virginia, and $30,000 to Dolly. It was a much smaller sum than he attended, and Dolly would be in financial trouble for the rest of her life. Madison's hope for the United States was the advice nearest to my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. In the 1840s, Dolly had to sell Montpelier, its remaining slaves, and a lot of her furniture to pay off debts. One of her younger slaves, Paul Jennings, recalled in his own memoir that in the last days of her life, before Congress purchased her husband papers, she was in absolute poverty, and I think sometimes suffered for the necessities of life. While I was servant to Mr. Webster, he often sent me to her with a basket full of provisions and told me whenever I saw anything in the house that I thought she was in need of, to take it to her. I often did this and occasionally gave her small sums from my own pocket. I had years before bought my freedom from her. So imagine a freed slave giving money to the woman who formerly owned him, that was a first lady, because she didn't have enough to live. In the fall of 1837, Dolly returned to Washington, and she and her sister Anna moved into a house that had been bought by Anna and her husband, Richard Cutts. Dolly took Paul Jennings with her as a butler. He had to leave his wife and children in Virginia. So Dolly died at her home in Washington in 1849, at the age of 81. She was buried in Congressional Cemetery, Washington, D.C. She was later interred at Montpelier next to her husband. And Madison's legacy was, in quote, "Madison's claim on our administration does not rest on a perfect consistency any more than it rests on his presidency. He had other virtues. As a framer and defender of the Constitution, he had no peer. No man could do everything for the country, not even Washington. Madison did more than most, and he did some things better than any, and that was quite enough." So although he was often overlooked, Madison is possibly one of the most important founding fathers. He shaped the way our government works today. In 2017, Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe issued a proclamation declaring it James Madison Appreciation Day on March 16th in honor of Madison's birthday and his impact on the nation. And in the proclamation, it highlighted Madison's role as father of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and recognized his vision, leadership, and commitment to shaping American democracy. And in the end, our country would not be the same had it not been for James Madison. Thank you all for coming.